Our ancestors lived in a constant struggle for survival. They faced predators, harsh weather conditions, and searched for food and shelter. But as the latest genetic research shows, there was a time in their history when all of this almost lost its meaning. Today, there are more than 8 billion people on the planet, but few realize that we exist only by a miracle. During this period, our population declined to a critical level. No more than 10,000 people survived. This period has been called the genetic bottleneck. Today, we will try to understand what caused this catastrophe and how our ancestors managed to survive. This story is not just about the past, but about how we, seemingly doomed to extinction, were able to go through this ordeal and survive. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how global catastrophes nearly destroyed humanity and why we exist only thanks to a handful of survivors. It all started with genetics. Scientists studying the DNA of modern humans from different parts of the planet noticed a surprising fact. Our genetic diversity is surprisingly low. If we compare ourselves to other species, such as chimpanzees, we are much more homogeneous. It is as if all humans were close relatives, albeit very distant ones. This phenomenon, known as the genetic bottleneck, indicates that there was a period in our history when the Homo sapiens population declined to a critical minimum. It was not just a decline, but a real collapse that brought our species to the brink of extinction. Scientists argued for a long time about the reasons for this event until they compared genetic data with geological data. And the picture that emerged is striking. The sky suddenly darkened for several years. This is not a scene from a movie, but a very real event that may have led to that very bottleneck. About 74,000 years ago, the supervolcano Toba erupted on the island of Sumatra. It was the most powerful eruption in the last 25 million years. A huge amount of ash and sulfur was released into the atmosphere, leading to a sharp global cooling, the so-called volcanic winter. The temperature on the planet dropped by several degrees, crops died, and incredible efforts were required to survive. The surviving groups of people, scattered across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, were isolated from each other by harsh climatic conditions. Over thousands of years, as the Earth recovered, these groups developed in isolation, and their numbers dwindled. Genetic research shows that during this period, our population may have numbered only a few thousand people. So few that a single mating could have changed the entire future history of our species. This catastrophe did not simply reduce the number of people, it shaped us into who we are today. And yet, despite this collapse, we survived. It was our ability to adapt and find solutions in the most unimaginable conditions that allowed us to overcome this crisis. Our ancestors not only survived the volcanic winter, but also laid the foundation for future civilizations that were able to colonize the entire planet. This story is a reminder of the fragility of our existence and the strength that lies in our ability to survive. Now that you know this, what other global catastrophes that killed thousands or millions of people do you know about? Write your answer in the comments. About 74,000 years ago, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in Earth's history occurred. The Toba volcano, located in modern-day Indonesia, spewed about 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma and ash into the atmosphere. It was not just an eruption, but a true super-eruption, the effects of which were felt around the world. Huge clouds of ash blocked out the sun, leading to a sharp drop in temperature. The temperature on the planet dropped by several degrees, triggering a new phase of the Ice Age. Crop failures began around the world, forests dried up, and animals died. It was a real ecological collapse that threatened human survival. This catastrophe was probably the main impetus for the decline in the human population. By studying geological layers, scientists are finding traces of this eruption, and geneticists are seeing its reflection in our DNA. But how exactly did this super-eruption affect the lives of our ancestors? Imagine that the life you knew was disappearing. The forests that provided food and shelter were turning into lifeless plains, and the animals you hunted were dying of hunger and cold. This was the world our ancestors faced. The Toba super-eruption caused a volcanic winter that could have lasted anywhere from 6 to 10 years. Because of this, the surviving groups of people scattered across Africa and Asia were forced to migrate in search of more favorable conditions. These migrations were difficult and dangerous, as they had to cross vast territories, encountering new predators and diseases. As a result of these events, the human population declined to a critical minimum. According to some estimates, there may have been only a few thousand people left on the entire planet. This is the genetic bottleneck that we see in our DNA. Due to the small number of survivors, our genetic diversity became very low. All of us modern humans are descendants of these few survivors. But despite all the difficulties, our ancestors did not give up. They showed incredible adaptability, learning to use new tools, adapting to new conditions, and developing social connections for survival. They began to hunt new animals and search for food in places where it had not been available before. This period, full of difficulties and trials, did not simply reduce our numbers, it tempered us. It made us more resilient and capable of surviving in the harshest conditions. This story is not only about disaster, but also about the strength of the human spirit. This catastrophe, which changed the course of history, makes us wonder, what other hidden catastrophes, invisible to the eye, could have influenced human evolution? Share your answer in the comments. After the eruption of Toba, dark times ensued, which may have lasted for several years. The sky was covered with a thick veil of ash, and the sun barely broke through it. This led to a significant reduction in vegetation, which was the basis of the food chain. Herbivorous animals lacking sufficient food died out. Predators followed suit. Humans at the top of the food pyramid also found themselves trapped. There was a catastrophic shortage of food. It was not just hunger, but widespread scarcity that forced people to migrate in search of food and shelter. However, wherever they went, the same harsh conditions awaited them. This period became a real test of endurance, which only the strongest and most adaptable survived. Survival in such conditions required incredible strength of spirit and resourcefulness. These migrations were not simply a change of residence, but desperate journeys across devastated lands, where every day became a struggle for survival. People broke up into small groups so as not to compete for scarce resources, but at the same time were strong enough to withstand the dangers. In these conditions, the only chance of survival was to show incredible adaptability. Instead of relying on old hunting grounds that no longer existed, they learned to obtain food from new unfamiliar sources. They became true masters of survival, gathering the last edible plants, hunting small game, and adapting their tools to new tasks. Social connections became even more important. Survival depended on close cooperation, knowledge sharing, and the transfer of experience from older to younger members of the group. In harsh conditions, where mistakes could cost lives, every bit of information was valuable. This was a period that, according to many scientists, accelerated the development of complex forms of language and communication, as effective coordination and the transfer of experience became critical to survival. This ability to act together, to seek and implement collective solutions, enabled small groups of people to withstand unimaginable hardships. Despite all the losses, the few who survived became the progenitors of all modern humanity. The genetic trace of this catastrophe is our common heritage, proof that we are all descendants of incredibly resilient and resourceful people. This period of suffering and deprivation was not just a dark chapter in history, but a true crucible of evolution that weeded out the weak and left behind those with the strongest will to live. It shaped us as a species, making us more resilient, intelligent, and united. This story is about how civilization as we know it was reborn from the ashes of catastrophe. Vast territories became uninhabitable. Tropical forests turned into deserts, and familiar hunting grounds became lifeless plains. Our ancestors had to seek refuge in places where conditions were less harsh. Scientists believe that coastal areas, where fish could be caught and seafood gathered, could have served as such refuges. It is also possible that some groups of people survived in oases, where water and vegetation still remained. The surviving groups were isolated from each other. They couldn't share experiences or resources, which led to their genetic isolation. This in turn led to the reduction in genetic diversity that we see today. What made people leave their homes and isolate themselves from the rest of the world? Imagine that the familiar world, full of abundance, suddenly becomes alien and hostile. The volcanic winter caused by the eruption of Mount Toba left our ancestors with no choice but to embark on a desperate journey. The global cooling and drought that engulfed the planet became the force that forced them to leave their native lands. They walked into the unknown, guided only by their instinct for survival, in search of places where life still remained. These were not just movements, but real migrations of survivors seeking salvation from impending death. In the coastal areas and oases where they found refuge, our ancestors had to completely rebuild their way of life. They could no longer rely on large game, which had become extinct, and were forced to find new sources of food. Fishing and shellfish gathering became the basis of their diet, which required new tools and skills. This change in diet and adaptation to new conditions not only saved their lives, but also contributed to the development of cognitive abilities, as they had to find unconventional solutions and invent new ways to survive. This isolation played a key role in the formation of our species. Cut off from each other, these groups developed independently, their numbers dwindled, leading to a sharp decline in genetic diversity. This is the founder effect. When a population descended from a small group of individuals, carries only a fraction of the genetic material of the original population. Although it was a period of great hardship, it was also a turning point that shaped modern humans. It served as a reminder of how fragile our civilization is, and that even the most unimaginable disasters can lead to unexpected changes. What made people leave their homes and isolate themselves from the rest of the world? We'll talk about that in a minute. As a result of the catastrophe, the surviving groups were scattered across the planet, and their numbers were so small that they could not effectively exchange genes. In small, isolated populations, mutations accumulate much faster. If a mutation was beneficial, it could spread quickly, accelerating evolution. However, if the mutation was harmful, it could also spread quickly and lead to the extinction of the entire group. This period was a real test for humanity, which brought us to the brink of extinction. It was a kind of lottery ticket, which we were lucky enough to win. This genetic isolation caused by the catastrophe had a dual effect. On the one hand, it could indeed accelerate the emergence of new traits. For example, adaptations for survival in harsh conditions, more efficient metabolism, resistance to new diseases, or the ability to digest previously unavailable food, could become established in an isolated group. It was like a kind of evolutionary experiment in which each small population tested its own unique survival strategy. On the other hand, this same isolation made the groups incredibly vulnerable. Any harmful mutation or genetic disease that would have been diluted and eventually disappeared in a large population could spread rapidly in a small group. This was especially dangerous if the group consisted of close relatives, which was inevitable in a bottleneck situation. A single unfavorable change in DNA could spell doom for an entire branch of humanity, cutting it off forever. That is why the survival of our ancestors was such an incredible event. It did not depend on a single lucky mutation, but was the result of a complex combination of factors: adaptation to new conditions, social cooperation, and, of course, pure luck. The groups that survived carried not just genes, but all the experience and knowledge accumulated during those dark times. They became the basis for future migrations, which eventually led to the repopulation of the planet. Thus, our ancestors not only survived the catastrophe, but also became carriers of a unique genetic code that allowed us to become who we are today. This story is about how humanity survived the face of extinction, but how exactly does our genetic history determine our ability to survive in the future? Write your answer in the comments. After the climate began to gradually recover, the surviving groups began to spread across the planet. This was not just resettlement, but a real odyssey that led to the exploration of new lands and continents. People learned to adapt to new conditions, invent new tools, and find new sources of food. They became smarter and more resourceful. But where exactly did our ancestors go in search of a new life? And why did these groups survive while others did not? It is believed that one of the first waves of migration was along the coast. The coastal route offered relatively stable resources, such as fish, shellfish, and seaweed, which were less susceptible to climate change than terrestrial flora and fauna. Following the coastline from Africa through the Arabian Peninsula and along South Asia, these groups gradually settled new territories, eventually reaching Australia about 65,000 years ago. This route was less risky than crossing the vast, barren interior regions. As the Earth continued to recover, other groups began to move deeper into the continents. Their journeys led to the settlement of Eurasia, and then via a land bridge that formed at the site of the present-day Bering Strait, the Americas. These journeys required exceptional ingenuity and adaptability. In new environments, with new types of animals and plants, humans were forced to create more sophisticated tools, including spears with tips, bows and arrows, which allowed them to hunt large game such as mammoths. The development of technology and social cooperation became the key to their success. The survival of these particular groups was not due to chance, but to a combination of factors. First, they found themselves in more favorable regions where the effects of the catastrophe were less devastating. Second, paradoxically, their small numbers made them more flexible in adapting to new conditions. They were willing to change their hunting strategies and explore new food sources. It was this willingness to change and innovate that allowed them not only to survive but also to thrive, laying the foundation for all future civilizations. Their story is not just a story of migration, but a story of the triumph of human will over adverse circumstances. But where exactly did our ancestors go in search of a new life? And why did these groups survive while others did not? Keep watching the video to find out the answer to this question. The people who survived the catastrophe became the foundation for all of modern humanity. Genetic research shows that all of us, regardless of race or nationality, have common ancestors who lived in Africa. It was a kind of Noah's Ark that allowed us to survive and populate the entire planet. It was not just survival, but a kind of reboot that allowed humanity to start from scratch. After the global cataclysm receded, the surviving groups scattered across the planet slowly began to rebuild their numbers. Adaptation to new conditions became the driving force behind their development. Those who managed to adapt to the changed climate and new food sources gained an evolutionary advantage. They began to master new technologies, create more sophisticated tools, and develop more effective hunting and gathering strategies. This period became the cradle of an incredible cultural and technological leap that laid the foundations for future civilizations. These small, genetically homogeneous groups gradually formed new waves of migration. They moved out of Africa, settling in the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and eventually America. Each new environment presented them with unique challenges, requiring new adaptations. In cold regions, people learned to sew warm clothes from animal skins, and in fertile valleys, they developed farming skills. It was a time of expansion and diversification that allowed humanity to conquer every corner of the planet. Thus, the catastrophe that could have destroyed our species served as a catalyst for its triumph. It not only reduced our numbers, but also forced us to become more resilient, intelligent, and inventive. We are the descendants of those who endured the greatest test in history. Our ability to cooperate, innovate, and adapt is the legacy we have inherited from them. This legacy reminds us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can overcome any difficulty. In addition to genetic evidence, there is also archaeological evidence. For example, traces of primitive tools dating back to the period after the Toba eruption have been found in Africa. This suggests that people were able to survive and continue their development. Traces of migration have also been found, indicating that people moved in search of better conditions. These findings give us an insight into how our ancestors struggled to survive. Archaeological finds really serve as material evidence of those dark times. Tools found in Eastern and Southern Africa tell us how our ancestors coped with the aftermath of the disaster. During this period, we see changes in technology. People began to use more versatile tools suitable for processing various materials and obtaining food in changing conditions. This suggests that they were forced to become adaptive masters of survival, changing their skills depending on the resources available. The traces of migration discovered by archaeologists are no less important. Finds such as stone tools characteristic of certain groups have been found in unexpected places, far from their presumed origin. For example, traces of the same stoneworking technology have been found in both Africa and the Middle East, supporting the theory of human travel and settlement. These findings paint a picture of desperate but purposeful movements as people followed the dwindling resources, leaving behind once fertile but now barren lands. In this way, archaeology complements the genetic picture, giving us a more complete picture of what happened. If genetics tells us that our population declined, archaeology shows us how it happened. It allows us to see not just numbers, but real stories of survival, how people use their intelligence and resourcefulness to overcome unimaginable difficulties. These ancient artifacts are not just stones, but silent witnesses to our shared history, reminding us that adaptability and innovation have always been our greatest weapons in the struggle for survival. Interestingly, the bottleneck not only brought us to the brink of extinction, but also made us who we are today. It is because of this event that we have such low genetic diversity, which makes us vulnerable to certain diseases, but at the same time contributes to our development. It is a paradox that shows that even the most terrible events can have positive consequences. The low genetic diversity we inherited from our ancestors who survived the Toba catastrophe really has two sides. On the one hand, it makes us more susceptible to certain diseases. In a large genetically diverse population, there will always be individuals who are naturally immune to new pathogens. However, after the bottleneck, this natural protection was lost. If there were no carriers of the necessary genes in the group of survivors, their entire lineage could have been vulnerable to the new disease, which could have led to the extinction of entire tribes and peoples. This explains why some hereditary diseases that are rare in other populations are more common in certain ethnic groups. On the other hand, the bottleneck could have been a catalyst for innovation and development. Surviving groups facing harsh selection were forced to rely not only on their physical abilities, but also on their intelligence. They became more inventive, mastering new tools and survival strategies. This adaptability and ingenuity became our main strength. Unable to rely on broad genetic diversity for protection, our ancestors developed a unique trait, the ability to learn and adapt quickly. Thus, the bottleneck became not just a test for humanity, but a springboard for a new stage of evolution. This event not only reduced our numbers, but also forged us into a species that was able to conquer the entire planet. We are the descendants of those who not only survived, but managed to overcome unimaginable difficulties by relying on their intelligence and social connections. This paradox shows that even the most devastating events in history can have far-reaching and unpredictable consequences that ultimately change the course of evolution for the better. The story of the bottleneck is not just a story about the past. It is a lesson for the future. It shows how fragile our civilization is. We live in a world where nuclear threats, climate change, and other risks exist that could lead to a new catastrophe. We must remember the past so that we do not repeat the mistakes of our ancestors. This ancient story of survival is directly relevant to the present day. The catastrophe caused by the volcanic eruption became a mirror in which we can see our own vulnerability. Today, we face threats that are no less dangerous than a super-volcanic eruption. Climate change, for example, is already leading to widespread droughts, floods, and extreme weather events that could undermine food security and lead to global migration crises. A potential nuclear winter or a pandemic of a new, deadly virus are all real risks that could trigger a new bottleneck effect. The lesson we can learn from the past is not only to recognize our fragility, but also to understand our strength. Our ancestors survived catastrophe through their adaptability, innovation, and social cooperation. These qualities are key to our survival today. If we want to avoid another catastrophe, we must learn to work together, regardless of borders and cultures. We must invest in science and technology that will enable us to cope with global challenges. This story is not about fatalism, but about hope. It shows that even after the most terrible crisis, humanity is capable not only of surviving, but also of becoming stronger. Our ancestors did not just wait out the storm, they emerged from it smarter and more united. Their legacy is not just genes, but proof that collective intelligence and the will to live can overcome any obstacle. Therefore, remembering the past, we must look to the future, understanding that our destiny is in our own hands. So, the story of the bottleneck is not just a theory, but a scientifically proven fact. It is a story of how our ancestors, on the brink of extinction, managed to survive and populate the entire planet. It is a story that should remind us how fragile we are and how important it is to protect our civilization. What are your thoughts on this topic? Do you think we could find ourselves on the brink of extinction again? Write your comments below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes about the most interesting and mysterious pages of history.